Japan sent roughly 15,000 veterans into the jungle to sever a single, vital road. The survival of an entire army depended on it. Standing in their way were just 1,500 capable defenders holding a remote ridge. Over a few tense days in the spring of 1944, the massive invasion force compressed the battlefield until there was almost nowhere left to fall back. The front line shrank so drastically that Japanese and Allied troops found themselves separated by nothing more than the width of a colonial tennis court. But it was exactly here, across this ruined lawn, that a sprawling empire's grand offensive began to die. In early 1944, Japanese Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi launched Operation Yugo. It was a staggering, high-stakes gamble, a massive offensive thrusting out of Burma straight into British India. Mutaguchi's primary target was the vital Allied hub of Imphal. He intended to capture the city, sever enemy communications, and trigger a cascading political collapse that would reshape the war in Asia. But grandiose plans rarely survive contact with geography. As Mutaguchi's tens of thousands of soldiers surged across the border, the vast scale of the invasion violently compressed. Impassable jungles and jagged mountain ranges forced the Japanese advance to funnel into a tight corridor. The sweeping arrows on imperial maps quickly shrank down to one fragile lifeline: the winding, precarious Dimapur-Imphal road. This narrow dirt track was the only way to supply the Allied forces trapped at Imphal. If the Japanese could cut it and hold it, an entire army would be choked out. Right in the middle of this crucial artery sat an obscure, quiet staging post named Kohima. It was not a fortress. It was barely a military target. Why did this tiny mountain ridge suddenly become the absolute center of gravity for a sprawling invasion? And how did a fraction of defenders manage to break the momentum of a veteran army? The answer lay in the brutal geometry of the terrain. Kohima was not a fortress, but rather a saddle-shaped ridge perched more than 4,000 feet above sea level. It was the highest point on the road between the vast Allied supply depots at Dimapur and the embattled army trapped at Imphal. On either side of this narrow saddle, the mountains dropped away into steep, unforgiving jungle gorges. There was simply no other way for an army to pass through with the heavy equipment, artillery, and supplies needed to sustain a major offensive into India. To choke the Imphal road, the Japanese had to take Kohima, and to save the Allied front from catastrophic collapse, Kohima had to hold. By the first days of April 1944, the illusion of safety at this remote hill station was violently shattered. The British High Command in India had made a fatal miscalculation. They believed the dense, mountainous jungle between the Chindwin River and the Naga Hills was a natural wall, impassable to any large military formation. But emerging from that very jungle, moving with astonishing speed and carrying their artillery on the backs of mules and men, was the Japanese 31st Division. Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato had pushed his 15,000 veterans through terrain the British deemed impossible, and now they were converging directly on the ridge. Waiting for them was not a fortified division of elite shock troops. The defenders of Kohima were a patchwork, desperate assembly of men who were never meant to hold off a major invasion. On paper, the garrison numbered roughly 2,500 men, but only about 1,500 of them were trained and equipped for frontline combat. The rest were a chaotic mix of rear echelon personnel: clerks, cooks, unarmed laborers, hospital orderlies, and recovering patients from a local convalescent depot. The Combat Corps was an incredibly diverse force. It included the recently arrived 4th Battalion of the Royal West Kent Regiment, who had rushed up the mountain road just hours before it was severed. Standing beside them were men of the Assam Regiment and the Assam Rifles, local troops who intimately knew the harsh environment. There were detachments of Indian paratroopers and a battery of mountain artillery. Command of this ragtag garrison fell to Colonel Hugh Richards, a veteran who arrived to find a logistical staging area rather than a defensible military position. Richards had mere days to transform a peaceful colonial outpost into a stronghold, organizing bakers and mechanics into rifle platoons just to plug the gaping holes in his line. Yet, this isolated mixed force had one critical advantage that the Japanese High Command entirely underestimated: the local Naga people. The British and Indian troops were virtually blind in the dense mountain jungles surrounding the ridge, but the Nagas lived in these hills. They knew every hidden trail, every river crossing, and every vantage point. As the Japanese 31st Division hacked its way toward the road, a vast, invisible intelligence network went into action. Naga scouts shadowed the approaching Japanese columns, quietly slipping back through the jungle to deliver highly accurate reports to the garrison. They warned Colonel Richards exactly where the enemy was massing, how many men they had, and which paths they were using. Without this early warning, the Japanese would have descended on the ridge completely undetected, overrunning the garrison in their sleep. But the Nagas did not just provide intelligence. As the threat loomed closer, hundreds of local villagers worked relentlessly alongside the soldiers to dig trenches, construct timber bunkers, and haul heavy ammunition up the steep slopes. When the firing eventually started, they would carry the wounded down perilous tracks under heavy mortar fire. Without the Naga people acting as the eyes, ears, and lifeline of the defenders, Kohima would have fallen before a proper defense could even be organized. Even with this vital help, the mathematical reality facing Colonel Richards was terrifying. 15,000 Japanese veterans were spreading out across the higher peaks overlooking the town, preparing to strike downward. Richards knew his 1,500 combat-capable men could not hold the entire perimeter. He was forced to make a ruthless tactical decision. He abandoned the wider valleys and the outer defense lines, pulling every single man, weapon, and crate of ammunition onto a tight, mile-long stretch of the ridge itself. The defense was consolidated into a series of interconnected hillocks with innocuous bureaucratic names: Garrison Hill, the Field Supply Depot, the Detail Issue Depot, and, at the very northern edge, the District Commissioner's Bungalow. Space was an absolute luxury they did not possess. The garrison was violently compressed into a tiny footprint. Infantrymen dug shallow slit trenches into the rocky soil, often just yards away from massive stockpiles of unarmored fuel and ammunition. There was no rear area. There was no safe zone. Every cookhouse, every medical tent, and every latrine was positioned directly in the potential line of fire. Geography had become a prison. The strategic stakes were brutally clear to everyone on the ridge. If Sato's 31st Division simply bypassed them and pushed down to the railhead at Dimapur, they could destroy the main Allied supply base. The entire 4th Corps trapped at Imphal would starve, and the Japanese would have an open door into the plains of India. The defenders of Kohima had to act as a human roadblock, forcing the Japanese to stop and fight, buying time for Allied reinforcements to mobilize hundreds of miles away. They had to anchor themselves to the ridge and simply refuse to be moved. On April 4th, 1944, the last vehicles made a frantic dash out of the hill station, speeding down the winding road toward Dimapur. Shortly after they passed, Japanese forward units emerged from the tree line and established heavily armed roadblocks. To the south, the road to Imphal was already firmly in enemy hands. The telegraph wires spanning the valleys were suddenly cut, plunging the garrison into absolute radio silence. The Japanese artillery, carefully hauled through the jungle, began to register their targets, dropping high explosive shells onto the exposed slopes. The 31st Division had successfully wrapped itself entirely around the position. The trap had snapped shut, leaving the isolated, mixed garrison completely cut off from the outside world as the Japanese tightened the noose. With the road cut and the telegraph lines severed, the siege did not begin as a slow, methodical starvation. It began as a violently accelerating crush. Lieutenant General Sato's strategy was brutally straightforward. Use overwhelming numbers to squeeze the isolated garrison from all sides until it simply snapped. As darkness fell over the Naga Hills, the Japanese launched relentless night assaults. Wave after wave of infantry surged out of the jungle, moving through the darkness to probe the British and Indian lines for any weakness. The defenders repelled them, but with each successive attack, the sheer weight of the Japanese numbers forced the perimeter to contract. The garrison was being pushed inward, yard by yard, onto a suffocatingly tight patch of high ground. By day, the nightmare shifted from massed infantry assaults to relentless psychological pressure. Japanese snipers tied themselves into the high branches of the surrounding jungle canopy. From these elevated perches, they had a terrifying, unbroken view directly down into the Allied positions. The geography of the ridge now turned against its defenders. Any movement above ground, to fetch ammunition, to relay a message, or simply to stretch, invited a sniper's bullet. The men were pinned in the rocky soil, unable to stand, baking under the fierce tropical sun. This extreme compression created a devastating reality for the wounded. In a standard military operation, casualties are evacuated to a secure rear echelon hospital. At Kohima, the rear echelon did not exist. The medical post was nothing more than a series of open trenches dug directly into the hillside, fully exposed to the constant rain of Japanese mortar fire. Men who had already been hit lay shoulder to shoulder in the dirt, entirely unprotected, enduring the exact same bombardment as the frontline riflemen. But the most agonizing threat on the ridge was not the incoming artillery, it was thirst. The primary water source lay just outside the tightened perimeter, completely dominated by Japanese machine guns. Every attempt to crawl out and fill a canvas bucket became a lethal gamble. The defenders were reduced to rationing a few desperate spoonfuls of water a day, fighting off severe dehydration amidst the choking dust kicked up by continuous explosions. The Allied High Command tried frantically to keep the garrison alive from the air, but the footprint of the defense had shrunk to microscopic proportions. Transport planes flew dangerously low through the mountain passes, dropping parachutes laden with ammunition and supplies. Yet, because the Japanese had squeezed the perimeter so tightly, a mere shift in the wind meant that crates of vital rations and mortar shells routinely drifted directly into enemy hands. Sato and his commanders watched the ridge burn, fully expecting this chaotic, dehydrated, and battered mixed force to finally break. By every standard metric of military doctrine, the garrison should have surrendered under the overwhelming claustrophobia of the siege. Instead, the exhausted clerks, cooks, and riflemen dug their heels deeper into the rocky dirt and refused to yield another inch. Realizing that starvation and bombardment would not collapse the perimeter fast enough, the Japanese realized they had only one option left. To take the ridge, they would have to step out of the tree line, close the final yards, and pry the ground from the defenders by hand. To force the issue, the Japanese commanders ordered their infantry to close the distance. The battle abruptly mutated from a siege of attrition into a primitive, suffocating brawl. General Sato's troops abandoned the relative safety of the tree line and began to claw their way up the terraced slopes of Garrison Hill. The geography of the ridge dictated a terrifying style of combat. Because the slopes were steep and stepped with agricultural terraces, the advancing Japanese infantry were largely shielded from direct fire until they crested the very edge of each level. For the British and Indian defenders, this meant the enemy did not appear as distant figures on a horizon, but as sudden, screaming silhouettes surging over the lip of a trench just yards away. Day by day, the fighting devolved into a relentless sequence of point-blank collisions. The Japanese launched the majority of their assaults under the cover of absolute darkness. The nights on the ridge became a kaleidoscope of chaos, illuminated only by the blinding, erratic flashes of exploding mortars and the stark glare of magnesium flares swinging beneath parachutes. In this stuttering light, waves of Japanese infantry threw themselves at the defensive perimeter. The combat was shockingly intimate. It was fought with the bayonet, the entrenching tool, the butt of a rifle, and bare hands. When a defensive position was breached, there was no room to fall back. The defenders simply counterattacked, rushing forward in the dark to retake trenches that were quickly becoming indistinguishable from mass graves. The rocky soil of the ridge was churned into a fine, choking dust, and as the fighting raged on, these shattered trenches turned into slaughterhouses of pulverized earth and splintered timber. The deafening roar of Bren guns, the sharp crack of Lee Enfield rifles, and the continuous concussive shocks of Type 97 grenades created a wall of sound that vibrated through the very bones of the men pinned to the ground. As the days bled into one another, a profound psychological shift began to take hold within the Japanese command. Initially, the officers of the 31st Division had approached Kohima with the confident expectation of a swift victory. They were veterans of campaigns in Malaya and Burma, men who were accustomed to seeing British imperial forces crumble or retreat when flanked and heavily pressured. Kohima was supposed to be a momentary speed bump, a minor tactical chore to be cleared away before the grand descent into the plains of India. But as the desperate ragtag garrison continued to hold out, that confidence soured into deep frustration, and finally into a blinding, fatal obsession. The Japanese perspective narrowed violently. The grand strategic vision of Operation Ugo, the capture of Imphal, the severing of the railway lines, the invasion of India, faded into the background. For the frontline commanders, the entire world shrank to the jagged, smoking silhouette of Garrison Hill. They became completely fixated on taking this tiny patch of dirt. The ridge transformed from a military objective into an absolute point of honor, a test of willpower that the Imperial Japanese Army refused to fail. This obsession overrode basic tactical sense. Instead of utilizing their superior numbers to fully bypass the remaining strongpoints or starve the defenders out over a longer period, Japanese officers continually fed their men into the meat grinder. They launched rigid frontal assaults against concentrated machine gun fire, determined to break the British and Indian lines through sheer, overwhelming momentum. From the Allied perspective, it was a terrifying spectacle. The Japanese officers could be heard in the jungle below, shouting commands, organizing their platoons, and sometimes even singing to build morale before an attack. Then, they would charge up the slopes, swords drawn in the moonlight, leading hundreds of men into the teeth of the defensive fire. When one wave was cut down, another would seamlessly take its place, stepping over the fallen to press the assault. It was a relentless, mechanical application of human pressure. The Japanese were bleeding themselves white, completely mesmerized by the necessity of clearing this one specific roadblock, oblivious to the fact that their broader invasion timetable was slowly tearing apart. As the perimeter inevitably contracted under this crushing weight, the physical and visual epicenter of the entire battle shifted to a single, deeply surreal location: the grounds of the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow. Before the war, this estate had been the epitome of colonial tranquility. It was a sprawling, elegant civilian home perched on a commanding terrace, surrounded by manicured green lawns, vibrant rhododendron bushes, and carefully tended flower beds. It was a place designed for afternoon teas and quiet administrative work, an enduring symbol of the British Empire's perceived permanence in the region. Within a matter of days, industrial warfare completely erased that world. The bungalow itself became a fortress, and then a primary target. Japanese artillery systematically disassembled the structure. Heavy explosive shells smashed through the elegant roof, blowing out the walls and collapsing the verandas. The polished floors and colonial furniture were buried under tons of shattered brick and burning timber. As the Japanese infantry pushed onto the estate, the fighting moved into the ruined rooms of the house itself. British and Indian troops fired through the shattered window frames, defending the flaming wreckage until the heat and the overwhelming numbers forced them to fall back. The defenders retreated out of the smoldering footprint of the bungalow and dug into the highest terrace of the garden. The Japanese immediately surged forward, occupying the lower terrace and the smoking ruins of the house. The two exhausted armies suddenly found themselves completely deadlocked, anchored to the earth on a piece of terrain that defied all logic of modern warfare. The front line had settled squarely across the estate's recreational tennis court. The transformation of this peaceful, manicured lawn into a hyper-lethal no-man's land was the ultimate regression of the conflict. The neat white lines marking the boundaries of the court were blown away by mortar strikes. The net was shredded into nothingness, replaced by a jagged, invisible line of fire. On one side of the court, dug into the slightly elevated edge near the clubhouse, were the remnants of the British and Indian defenders. On the exact opposite side, dug into the lower baseline near the ruined bungalow, were the Japanese. The distance separating the two opposing armies was less than 25 yards. This extreme, suffocating proximity created a battlefield dynamic unlike almost anything else experienced in the Second World War. The opposing troops were so close that traditional support weapons became entirely useless. To call in an artillery strike on the enemy side of the court meant dropping high explosives directly onto their own heads. Even small mortars were too inaccurate for a gap of 20 yards. The battle was reduced entirely to the rifle, the submachine gun, and the hand grenade. During the daylight hours, the tennis court was suspended in a state of absolute, terrifying paralysis. Any man who raised his head above the lip of his shallow trench for more than a second was instantly killed by a sniper. The air above the shredded grass was thick with a tension so heavy it was difficult to breathe. The defenders lay immobilized in the baking heat, covered in a mixture of sweat, dirt, and cordite. Because they could not stand up, they could not retrieve their dead, who lay exactly where they had fallen under the punishing sun. The stench of the battlefield became an almost physical weight. The men were forced to perform every bodily function while lying on their backs or stomachs in the dirt, clutching their weapons, their eyes fixed on the mounds of earth just a few strides away. But it was when the sun went down that the true madness of the tennis court revealed itself. The darkness did not bring a reprieve, it brought a horrifying intimacy. At 20 yards apart, the two sides could hear everything. In the dead of night, a British soldier shivering in his trench could hear the metallic clack of a Japanese rifle bolt being drawn back. He could hear the enemy whispering to one another, the rustle of their uniforms as they shifted their weight, the metallic clink of ammunition being unpacked. The proximity was a psychological torture. The Japanese, well aware of how close they were, utilized this intimacy as a weapon. They would shout across the dark expanse of the court in broken English, taunting the defenders, calling out to them, trying to draw fire to reveal their positions. The primary weapon of the night was the hand grenade. Both sides engaged in desperate, blind throwing matches across the width of the court. The defenders would listen intently for the distinct, sharp tap of a Japanese soldier striking his grenade against his helmet to arm the fuse, followed immediately by the dark shape of the explosive arcing through the night sky. Grenades rained down onto the British trenches, detonating with earth-shattering force in the confined spaces. In response, the defenders would pull the pins on their own Mills bombs, count to 3 to ensure the enemy wouldn't have time to throw them back, and hurl them across the invisible net line. Sometimes, the grenades collided in midair. Sometimes, a brave or terrified soldier would manage to catch an incoming explosive and heave it back into the darkness before it detonated. These grenade duels frequently escalated into sudden, chaotic infantry rushes. Without warning, a dozen Japanese soldiers would leap from their trenches and sprint directly across the cratered surface of the court. The distance was so incredibly short that they could cross it in 3 seconds. The defenders had no time to aim. They simply pointed their Bren guns into the darkness and held the triggers down until the magazines ran dry, firing blindly into the screaming shadows. The muzzle flashes illuminated brief, terrifying tableaus of men fighting and dying on the ruined grass, locked in desperate, hands-to-hand struggles that were as brutal as they were brief. When the attack was repelled, the survivors would scramble back to their respective baselines, and the grueling, nerve-shredding silence would briefly return to the estate. For days, this microscopic war of attrition continued over the same 25 yards of dirt. The defenders were trapped in a cycle of profound exhaustion. Sleep was entirely impossible. To close one's eyes was to invite a bayonet thrust in the dark. The men were running on adrenaline, operating in a hallucinatory state brought on by severe dehydration, the concussive trauma of non-stop explosions, and the absolute inability to rest. Their uniforms were rotting off their bodies. Their weapons were jammed with mud and the carbon buildup of firing thousands of rounds. Ammunition was running critically low. Quartermasters were crawling on their bellies through the communication trenches, stripping clips of ammunition from the dead to hand to the living, ensuring that every operational rifle was loaded. The garrison was being slowly, methodically bled white. Colonel Richard's desperate patchwork of clerks and mechanics had achieved the impossible by holding the line, but the line was now fraying down to a single thread. The perimeter had shrunk to the point where a single, coordinated Japanese push could wash over the entire hill in a matter of minutes. General Sato knew it. He could feel the resistance thinning. The Japanese officers prepared for what they believed would be the final, decisive surge across the tennis court, the push that would finally silence the ridge and open the road to India. The defenders fixed their bayonets, fully aware that they had nowhere left to retreat, bracing themselves for an annihilation they felt was only moments away. They were holding on by a frayed nerve, preparing to die in the mud of a colonial garden, when the impossible finally happened on the road behind them. In mid-April, the overwhelming pressure on the tennis court abruptly shattered. British tanks and fresh infantry from the 2nd Division, fighting their way up the mountain pass from Dimapur, finally battered through the Japanese blocking positions. They smashed into the perimeter, pouring heavy armor and reinforcements onto the devastated ridge. The starving, exhausted defenders were pulled back from the absolute brink of annihilation. The siege of Kohima was broken. On the surface, this feels like the natural end of the narrative. The relief column arrived, the ragged garrison was saved, and the immediate crisis was resolved. But a tactical victory does not end a campaign. General Sato's 31st Division had not been destroyed. He still commanded thousands of combat-hardened veterans entrenched in the dense jungle surrounding the ridge, heavily armed and fully capable of continuing the fight. If the Japanese army was still in the field, why did this massive, empire-shifting offensive effectively disintegrate in the weeks immediately following the relief of the garrison? The answer exposes a fatal, arrogant flaw buried at the very heart of the invasion. General Mutaguchi had engineered a brilliant strategic surprise by moving entire divisions through impenetrable terrain. But he had entirely ignored the ruthless, unforgiving mathematics of logistics. He never built a supply line capable of sustaining an army in India. Instead, he gambled his entire campaign on a single, desperate premise. His men would feed themselves by quickly capturing British supply dumps. Kohima was supposed to fall in days. The garrison's stubborn, impossible defense ruined that timetable. And by holding the line, those 1,500 men triggered a catastrophic chain reaction for the enemy. The delay allowed the calendar to turn, and with it came the true, unstoppable adversary of the Japanese invasion, the monsoon. Torrential, blinding rains slammed into the mountains, instantly transforming the steep jungle trails back to Burma into bottomless rivers of mud. With no captured British rations to eat and their fragile supply lines washed away, the immense distance that had guaranteed the Japanese their element of surprise now became an inescapable death trap. The battle for the ridge was technically over, but the operational reality had violently shifted. The soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army were no longer just fighting the Allies. They were fighting the jungle, the relentless rain, and the agonizing, creeping reality of their own empty stomachs. By late May, the mighty 31st Division had been reduced to a ghost army. Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato stood in the relentless downpour and watched his elite veterans disintegrating before his eyes. The destruction was not coming from Allied artillery, but from a complete, systemic biological collapse. The men who had hacked their way through impenetrable mountains just weeks earlier were now hollow-eyed skeletons, drowning in the deep monsoon mud. Severe dysentery, malaria, and typhus tore through the Japanese encampments with devastating speed. Without basic medicine, clean water, or bandages, simple scratches rapidly turned into lethal, festering tropical ulcers. The starvation was so absolute that highly trained infantrymen were reduced to boiling grass, digging for bitter bamboo shoots, and fighting over the rotting carcasses of their own pack mules. Sato was a fiercely loyal, combat-hardened commander who had spent his life serving the imperial army. But the agonizing reality on the ground was undeniable. His division was slowly rotting alive. He desperately radioed 15th Army headquarters in Burma, demanding the rations and ammunition he had been promised before the campaign began. The responses he received from General Mutaguchi, safely stationed in a dry command post hundreds of miles away, bordered on sheer delusion. Mutaguchi completely ignored the logistical catastrophe. Instead, he lectured his frontline commanders, insisting that a lack of food was no excuse for a lack of fighting spirit. He ordered Sato to maintain the offensive, to hold the surrounding ridges, and to break the British lines through sheer willpower. For Sato, the breaking point had finally arrived. In the rigid, fanatical hierarchy of the Japanese military, a direct order from a superior officer was absolute. To question it was a severe breach of discipline. To actively defy it was unthinkable treason. But Sato looked at the flooded trenches, strewn with the unburied bodies of the men who had trusted him, and realized that obeying Mutaguchi's phantom timetable meant the total, pointless annihilation of his entire command. There was no strategic objective left to achieve, only senseless murder. He sent one final, blistering transmission to his superiors, stating plainly that the tactical situation was impossible, that the men were starving, and that high command had utterly failed its soldiers. When Mutaguchi predictably refused to authorize a withdrawal and demanded a renewed attack, Sato did something almost unprecedented in modern Japanese military history. He ignored the supreme command. At the end of May, acting without permission and in open mutiny, Sato issued a direct order to abandon the offensive. He commanded his starving division to turn its back on Kohima. The veteran troops quietly slipped out of their flooded positions and began a grueling, agonizing retreat back into the dark jungle. This single, monumental act of defiance was the fatal blow. By pulling his men off the ridge to save their lives, Sato ripped the linchpin out of the entire Japanese invasion. The trap around the Imphal road instantly shattered, leaving Mutaguchi's grand, empire-breaking gamble dead in the Burmese mud. When the remnants of the 31st Division turned their backs on the ridge, the stark mathematics of the invasion finally came full circle. The 1,500 British and Indian defenders, that desperate patchwork of clerks, hospital orderlies, and stranded infantrymen, had not literally destroyed 15,000 elite Japanese veterans in a conventional shootout. They had not won through overwhelming firepower, and they had not won through complex tactical maneuvering. What they did was turn a tiny mountain ridge into an immovable anchor. By refusing to let the Imphal road fall, by holding on to a ruined tennis court and a shattered bungalow week after agonizing week, they weaponized the one resource General Mutaguchi absolutely could not afford to lose: time. The Japanese military possessed an astonishing capacity for enduring physical hardship, but human courage and massed bayonet charges cannot defeat the cold mechanics of broken logistics. The longer the garrison held the 31st Division in place, the more they allowed the ruthless reality of the environment to do the killing. The defenders essentially pinned the invasion force against the Naga Hills until the Japanese momentum smashed into walls that could not be taken by infantry assault. They let the vast distances, the torrential monsoon rains, and the empty supply chains slowly suffocate an entire army. The grand strategic vision of Operation Yugo, designed to shatter British India and reshape the Asian theater, was not defeated on a sprawling, open battlefield. It was paralyzed in a colonial garden. The defenders of Kohima proved that in a mechanized war of supply and demand, the most lethal action a small force can take is to simply stand in the way and refuse to be moved. forcing an overextended enemy to starve under the crushing weight of their own ambition. The Japanese had marched through impossible jungle to sever a vital lifeline, only to run headfirst into a brutal, inescapable truth about the nature of the campaign they had launched. The Japanese Empire marched thousands of miles through impenetrable jungle to conquer India, only to bleed to death on a tennis court because they forgot that a trapped enemy can steal your most vital resource, time.